It's a pretty good crowd for a Saturday, and the manager gives me a smile, 'cause he knows that it's me they've been coming to see, to forget about life for a while. Down at the bar is a friend of mine, gets me my drinks for free. Says, I could be a movie star. Oh no. Fuck. It's a pretty good crowd for a Saturday, and the manager gives me a smile, 'cause he knows that it's me they've been coming to see, to forget about life for a while. John is a real estate novelist. He never had time for a wife, and he's talking to Davy, who's still in the Navy, and probably will be for life. And the piano sounds like a carnival, and the microphone smells like a beer. They sit at the bar and thread in my jar and say, "Man, what are you doing here?" La da 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 da. La da 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 da. Hey, say, sing us a song, you're the piano man. Sing us a song tonight. We're all in the mood for a melody, and you got us feeling all right. Hello, folks. So we're all at the end here, wrapping it up. Bow on it. Beep, beep. This is the end of our, very long at this point because I had to take a break for tour, breakdown of Dawn of Everything by Grab Grow, R.I.P. We'll talk. Next week, I might do a stream. It will be earlier in the week because I'm going to be out of town later, but I'll probably just hang out, not going to do a book. I will probably announce the book that we're going to do next week, and then maybe give a couple weeks before we start it. Right now, I'm leaning towards Leo Panich's book, but we'll see. The Making of Global Capitalism, because I feel like there's something sort of nice about tying the bows together. If we're going to start with a book that's like, okay, how did regimes of power emerge, to now end on, okay, how do we get to the point where regimes of power are alienated completely out of human hands, which is what capitalism is. As first a tool of a ruling class, but eventually a self-aware structure of power and will, frankly, that overawes all human will and subordinates it to its purpose. That's what I think capitalism is at the end of the day. At the end of the day, folks, that's what it is. It is the technological alienation of the drive to dominate that animates class society. Focal point pivoted away from human will and intention and into a fully alienated algorithm of profit extraction. And so we start with how it started. Now it would make sense to now talk about how that got out of our hands. Because if what GrabGrow are describing here, or trying to, is the conditions that lead to the emergence of regimes of power that are human-based, that have technology in them, that are technological, but are still determined by human will. That is the beginning of a process that inevitably, I would argue, once it starts somewhere, once the first tumor pops into existence, it will inevitably overawe the entire world. And as it does so, as regimes of power dominate the world, the destruction of the environment, not necessarily destruction, but disruption of the ecological balance that allowed that regime of power to come into being, creates a destabilizing effect that over time destroys these structures. But because there is no challenge to the ruling class, it just reconstitutes itself with new cultural language, new technology to reassert its authority. But it gets more challenging over time because the exploited become more capable of resistance. Because at first they don't resist, they escape. Like they talk in this book a lot about how human freedom was sustained by the ability, the freedom, first of all, to leave. And that freedom meant it took a long time for power to assert itself over every citizen and make leaving impossible, and requiring then resistance. And the worse it gets, the more resistance there is. And the ecological conditions that sustain power are always deteriorating and destabilizing over time. So new technologies have to be forged to make that power more efficiently distributed. Laminate the coercive and consensus-seeking, or the carrot and stick of society, into one machine that can be operated at the push of a button. Because the thing that undermines class rule at the end of the day is, yes, you have a class interest, but it is not pursued by everyone within the class in the same way. It is pursued individually by members of a ruling class, which means that they might push the thing in one direction over time, but they don't have fine motor control in times of crisis. So they end up fumbling the bag. They end up getting diluted and destroying themselves. And this is what happens to your kings and your landed aristocrats, the aristocracy of the sword, as the emergent bourgeois, who are closer to the new technologies of state and control, are able to exercise them more efficiently and take power away from the old landed elites. They get bought off, but their power is taken from them. And now the bourgeois power has been taken, not by the working class, as Marx imagined it would, but by the very machines that they used to take power. And to me, this is why, while there's a lot of great stuff in this book, and it's really, really useful, in my mind, to understand like human capacity, human social capacity, as an abstract concept, it's a failure at trying to convince me that there's anything in those old ways of being that tells me how to avoid total annihilation of humanity by the machines it's created. Because it does not have anything to say about those machines. It has nothing to say about the role that technology and ecology play in pushing us into narrower and narrower chutes where we are forced to destroy one another in greater and greater displays of violence in order to maintain alienated class structures. Because they want to make us believe that once these machines get in place, once sovereignty is wedded to charismatic politics and is wedded to administration through the application of technologies such as agriculture, that they obliterate that world and they make a new one that we have all been living in ever since. And now we're at the end state of it. And it's not an end because there's necessarily going to be an apocalypse, an end of humanity. That's what we dream of and seek and hope, because it means we don't miss anything. We don't miss some sort of, efflorescence of humanity. All we miss is like more misery. Oh, great, fantastic. I'll get raptured up now. Thank you, please. But just a case where our rulers change to the machines. And that there is no more subject. There is no more human subject that there used to be, because as it was redefined by the emergent state structures, it is now being redefined by this stateless, globalized, universal architecture of symbols delivered electronically that have turned us into different beings again. Now that Doesn't mean that from these beings we can't build something else. But it will be in the rubble. It will be outside of this teleology of humanity. Because it is a teleology, and that's the big thing that's wrong with what Grave Grower. They repel at the notion of teleology. But there is a civilizational teleology. As soon as you establish the regimes that these guys find icky and want to talk around and want to imagine alternatives to that could have existed at one time, yes, that's not necessarily teleological, and they do a good job undermining the notion that it is. But in the cone of civilization that extends until it includes everybody, there is an embedded teleology. And we're living in it, baby. So the end of this, the conclusion of this book is honestly it's a pretty damp squib, because the one thing they've been talking around the whole book is, well, how did we get stuck with civilization? If there is all this possibility, if we always have this, and we lived for so long in possibility, how the hell did we let this happen? And they finally get to gesture towards it, and I gotta say, it is very unpersuasive. It's very uninteresting. They basically say, well, regimes of domination emerged out of regimes of care, because eventually the function of caring for those who are vulnerable, which they say early social orders socialized, literally, the care of those who couldn't be cared for by their own families, under the auspices of the monarch usually, or like the chief or whatever. And that was originally bringing someone into a family, but over time it became essentially a role of slavery and domination. And it's like, dude, psychologically, that's probably very true. Like that is the story of the intimate social transformation, the psychic transformation that turns someone who at one time saw everybody under their umbrella of social life in this definition of like humanity, full humanity, that I could imagine someone beneath me. And the way they say it, the way they imagine it is, if runaways and the disabled and the catastrophically widowed are thrown out of the small nodes of self-sufficient and self-sustaining and mobile, this is key, social order that I used to be a part of, that I can still find succor under the auspices of, the ritually affirmed embodiment of the community, which is what, your headman, your chief, whatever is. But that relationship can move from one of intimate, family to, under, I would argue, conditions of scarcity and trauma, into one of domination, where I don't see you anymore as a family member. I see you now as a burden. And it's like, that's a great description, dude. But guess what? You're forgetting what you're intentionally avoiding. What would have caused that change is an environmental shift. The conditions for life would have changed. They just imagine it changing over time, just like a vibe shift, as if everything doesn't have a fucking cause. I would say that the better, more expansive way to explain this, and the thing that would have honestly made this book really compelling and fully developed, but they couldn't go with because it would have gone against their allergy to determinism and materialism more broadly, which is that, hey, they fucking had this breach in their understanding of care because the conditions that sustained life in an equilibrium were no longer available. And they had to change them. And that means that eventually civilization will emerge. Just like a modern subject eventually will get cancer if it lives long enough. You can't say, oh, you're inevitably going to get cancer, when you're 24, or on a day that a tumor is going to emerge. But you could say given the fact that you have a basically endless timeline here, because you have a relative equilibrium between humanity and the biome, something is going to pop up. A tumor is going to fucking pop up because of trauma, because of social carcinogens accumulating. And that's, I think, a full telling that then we can use to understand where we are now. But their ideological priors, their anarchism, makes them incapable of seeing it. They're literally incapable of seeing what's right in front of them. And it's because they are existentially repelled by the implications of that. And here are the real implications. It is, well, I am not actually a liberal subject. I'm not an ego. I am not me. Like, that's why it's the socially like perfected concept of liberalism, but it is motivated by the liberal fantasy that we are eternal subjects, not socially embedded, not determined by our conditions. And I'm sorry, that's what we are. And that is why change, if it happens, will not be initiated by some sort of collective act of will. It will be changing conditions, changing our responses to those conditions. And Marx's conception is that because of the common experience of exploitation by capitalism, you would get this new fusion of liberal subjects into a new type of relationship that is more like what they're imagining, an expansive social type of existence. But you can't just port the liberal self into that. You have to assume that you will literally have a change in the subjective experience of life, definitions of words, what symbols mean, like what the self is. And that's going to change your relationship to everybody else around you, your notion of obligation, your notion of social ritually pledging yourself to something other than you, alienating some degree of autonomy to a collective, to act collectively. It has failed to occur. That is a true point. But anarchism has failed even worse. It has not even been able to assert power anywhere that has not popped like a soap bubble, much like those wonderful North American woodland societies that they jack off to in the last chapter. So that's my beef with the book, even though I highly recommend everybody read it for the details, read it for the putting on its head a lot of your it does challenge a lot of sort of unthinking cliches that a lot of us have, including myself, instead of like really fleshed out narratives of things like the deep past, which are hard to get your head around a lot of ways, so you sort of let cliche fill in the holes. This does a great job of breaking up your cliches and challenging them and making you look at them again. But it does not do what they want it to do, which is turn people into anarchists. At least not this guy. And one of the things that really helped me sharpen my critique of this, what's wrong with my audio? Why do these people do this to me? Okay. One of the things that helped me sharpen a lot of my thoughts about this and really like hone in on what was bugging me the whole time I was reading it, because like I said, it's a fun read, it's a lot of cool detail, and there's nice conjectures, things that like slap you in the face. But the whole time I'm thinking like I got a pebble in my shoe and I've got like a too big wallet. I'm just not centered. And it's because there's so much of this book that while you're reading it feels very convincing because of the language used, that if you look back on it, it's really just conjecture, filling in huge gaps. And they kind of win you over by winking at you and saying, yeah, we're doing this, but just take our word for it so we can keep going. The problem is that's the whole book. It gets entirely marbled that way. It doesn't pay back the good faith of accepting their reasoning with some big resolution to the argument that like rests on firmer footing. And so you're like, okay, yeah, it was a little shaky getting here, but now that you're here, you can't deny this. If it had gotten there, I would have forgiven a lot more, but it just doesn't. The whole thing is that. It's just all shaky foundations the whole way around. And then basically just saying, yeah, but wouldn't it be pretty to think so? That's the final pitch. And anyway, the thing that I read that helped me really pinpoint a lot of things that were bugging me reading it is a review of the book by my main man, Walter Scheidel. Anybody who's been a long-term follower of the pod knows that I'm a big Scheidel head. I think that he's one of the great living non-Marxist materialist historians. Like, he is absolutely not a Marxist. He is one of those guys who sees the teleology of capitalism and says, good, the machine should be in charge. And it's like, okay, cool. But because he does have that, like, he understands that this is a process of this emergent system. And a Marxist would say, this is the opposite of humanity. Guys like Scheidel, even if they don't know it, are really thinking, no, this is the apotheosis of humanity. But that makes them able to see clearly a lot of stuff that Grabgrow, because they're romantic liberals who think that their liberal subjectivity is eternal and not historically contingent, and that it was different and it will be different in other contexts, and in the future, it's not some fixed identity point, I'm sorry, with rights that is like somehow transcendent of time and space. So Scheidel, one of the, anyway, but his book, I've recommended before, Escape from Rome, great leveler, really good. I think he's working on a new one that I'm very excited to read. But he wrote a review of this book, which is like a perfect match, because he is, in many sense, the absolute opposite of these guys, because he's also a liberal. But whereas the Grabgrow liberals are repelled by the machine, Scheidel is a fan. And when their job is, I mean, if your job is mounting a barricade and fighting a war, we know who we'd rather be fighting with. Grabgrow, obviously. We know who'd side in like a battle, or actual battle we would be on. But in the question of determining like what is happening in the world around us, Scheidel's demonic submission to the machine makes him a superior historian. So Scheidel reviews this book, and I read the Scheidel review, and Scheidel also, like I, says that the book is worth reading, fun to read, challenges a lot of orthodoxies meaningfully, and for a layperson especially is a great way to break up, stuff that might be like old and accumulated muck in our popular, pop science understanding of the past. But like their actual, argument is just absolutely founded on a lot of either stuff that has been around for a long time that is not mind-blowing, that all of the relevant fields have totally assimilated into their understanding, and therefore not mind-blowing, or it's just conjecture based on that. Like a good example of that is they say that in a lot of these societies that eventually become, they say everywhere that there is no fixed correlating relationship between, things like agriculture and urbanization and regimes of hierarchy, because people moved around within them. And there were seasonal cycles where people would come together, live communally under like control of a monarch, and then they would disperse. And for Grabgrow, the fact that pattern existed, means that those things getting together into a group don't cause hierarchy. But another way to look at this is that on a long enough time scale, that phenomenon of people coming together in those formations is what prepares them to become permanent. Like if they stayed out in forager groups that never came together, how would they ever have created a hierarchy? Like what they're actually describing with this cyclical thing is the building of the preconditions for the hierarchy. People aren't going to submit to a permanent hierarchy before they have had the temporary one. And like that is, to me, an even more persuasive description of that evidence. But the only difference, And there's absolutely no the evidentiary distinction between that interpretation and Grab Grows. Grab Grows, where it's this, yeah, they were all chilling, and that means that they're never going to turn into, concentrations of power, even though they did everywhere else. And how did they everywhere else? By first having those cyclical, seasonal relations. What they want to say is that because this didn't happen instantaneously, because there's no correlation between, you have agriculture, boom, you have civilization. You have urbanization, boom, you have hierarchy. Because they're saying there's no, moment of, Big Bang explosion and correlated between, material relationships, then they're not materially determined. But what if it's a gradual process? What if it's a thing that happens over a long time and it accumulates and reaches an inflection point? And nobody at the time realizes that's happening. They always want to say on this thing that this doesn't mean that these things being together here means that they were not on the cusp of developing some sort of hierarchical relationship. But what about the places where there was agriculture that came after foraging? Because you're saying because foraging existed at one point before the agriculture, that there was no cusp situation. But then there's never a cusp anywhere. Nobody is ever on the cusp. You've gotten rid of the concept of the cusp. And that's fine, because it doesn't tell us anything about the determinative relationship. If things like agriculture and urbanization do not cause hierarchy to emerge, they provide an accelerant and a catalyst for them to be developed. Once the things that do, which they have still not even gotten to, maybe it's care regimes, say, okay, your care regime changes like they imagine. Your care regime is now one of domination. Now, how does that go from something that breaks up cyclically to something that concentrates and becomes a self-perpetuating state based on class domination? It is provided the accelerant and catalyst of access to, say, cereals, access to, say, horses and draft animals. The things that you're saying didn't cause it guarantee that it will emerge if the thing that did cause it happens. And the thing that did cause it to happen, happened, and would have to have happened, and inevitably would have happened. And how do we know? Because, say it with me, it happened. If it happened one place in the human biome, the Gaia ball we live on, it would happen somewhere. It was going to happen somewhere. And why it happened someplace and not others is not, well, here, I guess they were better at facilitating one another and they were more chill dudes or something. They had better vibes. That's basically what it boils down. Oh yeah, in North America, they just had better vibes. Okay, great. But in the place where they have bad vibes, they also have cereal agriculture and horses. So it doesn't matter whose vibes are what. They could have had great vibes over in the other place too. The exact same good vibes. But if they have good vibes and agriculture and horses, maybe they get bad vibes. Maybe the vibe changes. There is a vibe shift. And it has nothing to do with human choice. It has to do with ecological conditions, resources, access to resources, and the environment. For example, less stable relationship to food. Because where all these places where people had good vibes and nothing changed also had super abundance of food. Where did civilization emerge? In places where abundance fluctuated. And all of a sudden, these good vibe people have the same vibes as North Americans do. All of a sudden, the vibe shifted. Because more trauma associated with seeking limited resources messes up, the vibe in the community. But then maybe in North America the same thing happens, but then the stable relationship with the ecology smooths it out. But maybe somewhere else, because you have a more unstable relationship with the environment, it persists. Oh, and also access to things like horses and fucking cereals. Because one thing that they point out here that is kind of honestly a dagger in the heart of the argument is that they say you had globally, you had this 5,000 year period before there's any kind of like dominant social structures. And why don't we talk more about that than the 5,000 where we have them? And one of the reasons is because it was first, which means it's a foreign country in a way that the 5,000 years that came after and that rebuilt society every day, psychically and materially, along those lines, fixed it, froze it, is more meaningful. But forget all that. Worldwide, we see that there is about a 7,000 year long period between the adoption of agriculture in an area and the creation of these settled conglomerations. Like one of the things they want to point out, that GrabGrow want to use to point out that there's no like determined relationship is, in the emergence of the Holocene, that 7,000 years, that period when the gun goes off, basically, the stabilization of the environment after the retreat of the glaciers, there's all these areas, and that some of them didn't get any development of hierarchy and domination, and others did. But the thing is that every place that developed hierarchy, that developed the state, was one of those early areas. And the ones that didn't, like, for example, North America and the Polynesia, did not have sufficient cereal in their environment to create the sort of storable, durable, taxable surplus that allows a state to flourish. So you got a 7,000 year period. So it's 7,000 years from the emergence of life in the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley and China and everything until you get the states. But because humans settled they moved east to west, right? And the New World is literally the New World, not because it was discovered by Europeans, but because the people got there last. So it took longer for agriculture to emerge. And in North America, where GrabGrow make their like resting argument about the possibility of humanity to avoid domination, they didn't get maize, which is the only real cereal in in the Americas at that time, and which is an inferior for the purposes of taxation and storage and all that, inferior to other cereals like grain and rice. So it's one of the least useful cereals, and it showed up even later. So guess what? By the time that Europeans are knocking on the door of North America, it has been about 7,000 years. So all you're really arguing here is that you get about 7,000 years, and then one way or another, it's coming, it's knocking on your door. Because of that relationship between human social structures and their environment. Their environment. And like their big thing is they insist that if something is not the proximate cause of something else, then it did not determine it. And I'm sorry, proximate causes are fun to understand and useful to, especially when you're talking about like the recent past and applying it to the life you have now. But when you're talking about like real, like defining answers to questions like what caused something, they're meaningless. It's like a building. Once like this, once a controlled demolition of a building begins, it's going to fall down. You don't. There's going to be specific things that are going to cause the thing like struts to fail, and you can describe those, but that's not the thing that did it. The general trends are what answer general questions. And what these guys try to do is answer general questions with these proximate causes. But a general trend cannot be answered by finding the proximate causes for it. You need a general influence, and it's the fucking environment. like some of the stuff they use, for example, to talk about cities and how urban life did not equal hierarchy, involves just like making stuff up. Like the first cities were not in Mesoamerica; they were in the Fertile Crescent, China, Indus Valley. That is where the first cities were. Like they're literally just fudging numbers there, and also their big example of Teotihuacan, the place that had like monumental architecture, and apparently when it was built, did almost immediately have hierarchy. Like Teotihuacan started off by Grabro's own admission as this cathedral of executions and ball sports and aristocratic violence that marked the Inca and the Aztecs and the Olmecs before them. And then it was overthrown, and you had this temporary, like 200-year period where instead of building temples and monuments and executing people, they built public housing. And it is a very interesting story. It's one of the most interesting parts of the book, something I had no idea had ever existed. But also, it's literally the only one you can find. So like if it's an outlier, you haven't proven anything. But Grabro basically take this and say, this is the model of early states. Also that the Fertile Crescent societies had all that stuff about assemblies. That's all just wish casting. It's like, here's public forums. They must have been where people came together to talk about political issues. It's like, maybe. And once again, if filling that gap in with conjecture led to a greater, more salient truth, it would be worth taking. But as just one of another bits of speculation, it just falls apart. And other stuff, they just allied. Like when they compare the cyclical social arrangement of the megasites of Ukraine to Basque villages that still to this day use this like circular social structure to do non-hierarchical civic life. And he compared them and said that the evidence that the Basques still exist proves that like these social models worked. The Basque villages are not built out as circles. There's no circular relationship. It is a clan relationship that is extended over distance. Like these are farmhouses spread out throughout the countryside. So it is literally taking two different types of cyclicality and equating them because they're the same shape. Even though one of them is physical and the other one is conceptual. And their whole argument that the state never emerges, that you never have a state, is essentially that because you don't have things that correspond to the 19th century German definition of state that was built by the era of great power nationalism in Europe. Like the entire discipline of history as we understand it as a social science was founded in Wilhelmine, Germany in the late 19th century. Guys like Leopold von Ranke. And they defined a lot of they defined the terms that we use for a lot of historical concepts, one of them being the state. And Grabro take this definition and say that because that didn't exist back then, and you can't recognize it in these things, then there is no such thing as a state. The state isn't a concept. And it's again because they disembody things from their social relations, and then they make them eternal concepts, and there is no such thing. But there is one bit of really sneaky shit here that stood out to me because people who have been watching these, that I noted already. I generally read this thing credulously, like, okay, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt while I'm reading this, because I want to engage with it in good faith, and the story they were telling was very compelling. So I wanted to give them that benefit because I wanted to hear the next thing in an open framework so that I can absorb it. But this one I put a little asterisk next to and said, what are we actually saying here? And that was when he's describing the Mesoamerican tribe or the Mesoamerican civilization community, whatever you want to say, that allied with Cortez against the Aztecs when the Spanish showed up. And he describes their power structure there as this like democracy, as essentially as an Occupy Wall Street style General Assembly. Everybody comes together and debates the questions of the day, and then comes to a consensus decision, and then acts on it. And of course, I pointed out at the time, it's very funny that like the one actual example of like real democracy being enacted in that they actually talk about, like a specific moment, is these people saying, "Hey, let's ally with these literal demons in human skin, these fucking chalk-faced monsters, these metal centaurs belching fire that clearly want to consume the entire fucking continent." And people at the assemblies were saying these people are a curse, and they said, "You know what? Fuck it, we're going for it." But anyway, so like that's separate from the greater question that I also raised, which is, what is the political economy in here? Because you're saying everybody together is deliberating, but is this like a bunch of yeoman farmers who all work their own land? Or is there some relationship of dependence here, of domination, as it were, socially, like class power? Forgetting, everybody gets to assemble in the great hallway to deliberate. Yay, this is democracy. Okay, but what is the social structure? And I didn't know. And so I said, what is it? But this is fascinating. Scheidel is able to basically answer my question here by completing a quote that Grabgrow shortened intentionally to try to make their point. So when trying to argue that this group was democratic, they quote Cortez in his letters back to Spain, where he says, quote, "It is that their government, the Tlaxcalan government, is, quote, almost like that of Venice or Genoa or Pisa, because there is no one supreme leader." Venice or Genoa or Pisa, because there is no one supreme ruler. And that's where Grabgrow ended. But the full quote is, "There are many lords, all living in this city, and people who are tillers of the soil are their vassals, though each one has his lands to himself, some more than others. In undertaking war, they all gather together, and thus assembled they decide and plan them." Now you might say, oh, okay, they all decide. So even the vassals decide. But it's like, the vassals decide now. Are you calling this a fucking democracy? The Athenians had that, where the slave owners would gather together and fucking debate. But in reality, this was a hereditary aristocracy where about 100 people got together. The Roman Senate, basically. So the exact things that ruled in the old world, where regimes of domination had risen up like a monster and destroyed humanity, are also existing here. Well, congratulations. Now you might say, oh, he was just assuming he was from Europe, he couldn't recognize any other freedom. Well, okay, then his thing about them being a democracy doesn't mean anything either. Either he had an insight or he didn't. If he couldn't see anything in front of his face because he was too blinded by the ideology he grew up with, well, then it's a meaningless piece of evidence either way. So yeah, that's Scheidel's review. He says a bunch of other stuff. It's all very cutting. You can tell that he's pretty kind of annoyed by how much they like run down their colleagues in anthropology and archaeology, the social sciences, how much they want to shit on them because they're a bunch of brainwashed rubes who have ignored all this evidence. And Scheidel's like, look, all this evidence has not been ignored. It's all been absorbed. And a lot of the people a lot of people have said a lot of the same stuff you're saying. They just have not decided to create a flight of fancy to support a political project. But there's a quote here At the end, I want to read just the last paragraph of Scheidel's review. Somebody asked where it's published. I think it's it's probably in a paywalled journalistic or a scholarly document. And of course, this is the problem we have with trying to square the circle of scholarly pursuit as political activism versus pursuit of the truth, because these guys are trying to do a political thing, and Scheidel is trying to make a academic, refined point, and so they're doing different things. But I would say that on the narrower question of like, okay, Grabgrow, you're doing this politically, and God bless you. People should do this stuff. I think I do this stuff. I really do feel like stuff like Hell of Presidents and the thing I'm going to do about the crisis of the 17th century. I really feel like I'm trying to do the same thing Grabgrow is, but because he's an anarchist, because they're anarchists, they're wrong, basically. It boils down to that, It's like, you're not wrong, you're just incorrect. And that means I have to, when reading it, try to understand that. So anyway, this is Scheidel's last paragraph, where he, after just like winding up by saying their big failure is that they reject material explanations. They reject technological. I mean, they don't even reject them. They fail to integrate them into their analysis. Technology and environment. Technology and ecology are invisible. They're not even engaged with. They're hand waved away. And these are like the things that, I'm sorry, this is, you can agree or disagree. Like, this is where you can't merely make any kind of empirical argument. It is down to gut feeling. These things either determine us in a significant way, and something political flows from that. Like, it's not just an isolated fact that we can skip over. It is determining of our conditions and therefore determining our choices. So we have to engage with it. Or it's a big, gross boogeyman that makes us all... basically, their idea is that the idea of determinism and materialism are what prevent us from doing effective activism. If we believed harder, we would fix things. Like, they literally think, if you consider technology, if you consider ecology, you are submitting to the matrix. And once again, that is a question of like deep epistemology that cannot be resolved, never will be resolved, and can't. You can just circle around them forever. And that is what this has all been. It's been me circling around our like conflicting worldviews, circling around each other like a little atomic particle, and then throwing off light in the form of these posts that you then absorb. And then you can take from all of this whatever and apply it to your life, aesthetically, emotionally, intellectually, and hopefully practically. But anyway, this is the quote at the end of the review that I thought really sums it up. After saying, like, look, you're too idealism. You're doing too much idealism. It's not to somebody who needs to know. It is not either persuasive, and if it is persuasive, it leads them in the wrong direction. Like, that's where it boils down to. Like, to somebody who has a different, essential position, it's not going to make me. It's not going to change my mind. But for somebody who doesn't have that, is just sort of unmoored intellectually, but wants to do the right thing, it'll push you in the wrong direction. So that's why it's a failure in both respects, even though it's a very good book that people should read. There you go. This is the contradiction at the heart of everything that fuels and powers everything. So this is Scheidel's last paragraph. Their idealist purism traps Graeber and Waingro in a cage of their own making. Acknowledgement of materialist perspectives would have helped them draw more meaningful connections between past and present. If it was their mobile lifestyle and hybrid mode of subsistence that made it easier for Holocene foragers to step in and out of different forms of cooperation than it was for full-blown farmers who found themselves tied to their lands and crops, how do we compare? Do service economies, digital tools, and globalization hold out the promise of a new dawn? Materialism is not the enemy of historical understanding. It is essential to it. Nor is it the enemy of social activism. It might even be its best friend. And even though he's coming from a different political perspective than I think Scheidel and I have a very share a belief that you cannot act effectively off of faulty foundations. If you're being motivated intellectually, here's the thing. This is where we talk about how the coalition of humanity is always a intra-class coalition. It's also a coalition of different types of minds. There are people who need to be motivated intellectually to do something, to act. And you need to give them an intellectual motivation. And that's what this stuff is good for. But there are also people who don't need that, who have an emotional connection to the good and want to push it. And they just need to be told maybe where to go. And the way they do that is talking it out with other people who have same combination of intellectual and emotional connections to the course of action of humans against the machine. And for people who don't need to be intellectually convinced, who aren't operating, I should say, differently. They need to be intellectually convinced, but their conviction doesn't rest on intellectual belief. It rests on a deeper foundation of emotional connection. Then this is just going to be if I'm a pixie, if I believe hard enough, I can just imagine away all of the chains of technology and ecology that have rendered me a fundamentally different subject than the people he's talking about. I do not have the capacity to flee into the unknown, to remake in wilderness that allowed all of the liberty that he describes in this book to accumulate. And I will say, though, that if Graeber was still alive and he read that Scheidel review, he would probably challenge the guy to a duel because he was a prickly motherfucker. When Debt came out, he basically went ham on anyone who said that it wasn't perfectly accurate. And I remember I read a Crooked Timber symposium on Debt when it came out, and all the articles were very respectful, and most of them said the book had a lot of real benefits and that it helped reframe a lot of their thinking on deep issues. But that specifically there was a lot of eliding and there was a lot of sort of fudging. And then they, and some people, and they had a lively debate well, does that really matter? Are we just talking semantics? And it was a pretty good back and forth. And the last blog post was going to be Graeber sort of responding. And they'd had these symposiums on Crooked Timber is a blog in the old blog days. I'm a million years old. Before Twitter, there were blogs, and people would get together on blogs to talk about things. And I got to say, one of the things that has accelerated human insanity is that we got rid of the forums and blog culture that allowed people to self-segregate, and now have been dumped en masse onto the internet. And we don't have rules for it, and it's driving us insane. And when they had these symposiums, the last culminating post would be by the author, who would then respond to everybody. And then they would have a debate, or not a debate, they would have a good faith discussion. And Graeber went on there, and he just said, fuck all of you. You all are a bunch of fucking pinhead shit fucks obviously not literally, but in academic language, in the incredibly cozy lingo of academia, which all those people who were writing were part of. He just went ham on them. He went beast mode. And it's very funny to imagine him responding to that review because he would not take it kindly. But I feel like that's a very similar thing. You got a lot of great detail in that book. I think in that book, the fudging is different and better because his cumulative argument is, I think, more persuasive about, America wielding debt as, the basic framework for domination of the economy of global capitalism. But of course, it doesn't have The greater framework is wrong. But anyway, that's another interesting book that is, once again, like spackled over with a lot of fancy. But there is a fundamental problem with arguing like a debt jubilee would bring human, autonomy back, because again, if we can't farm for ourselves, if we can't fend for ourselves, we are constrained in a way that other people you're imagining wouldn't be. Somebody also asked about Guns, Germs, and Steel, and I feel like that's another book in this this kind of bucket where it's like worth reading, and I think worth reading to break up what I said earlier, the sort of offhanded, unthought through cliches about history that you carry around in your head. Because there's tons of strawmans in everything, everywhere, all the time. The dawn of everything. The strawmen are everywhere. But like they could argue, well, okay, sure. Academics know all this stuff, but the general public doesn't. And it's like, yeah, but I mean, the general public doesn't know much. The general public is pretty. There's not a lot in their head. There's not a lot of space in their head devoted to understanding early humanity. There's just a few big cliches, and because this stuff accrues over time and is communicated like first in academia, then into the greater culture, then into just sort of folk understanding. Like that is a long-term process. So yeah, like. A lot of the notions that people who even do have concepts about the deep past, which isn't that many people, a lot of people don't have anything there. It's completely empty. The shelf is empty. Those who do have outdated ones. So you're breaking up, concentrate, like mental kidney stones. And I'd say that Guns, Germs, and Steel, because it thinks in terms of deep causes, that it rips human life away from the narrative of autonomy that animates the liberal understanding of the self and of history. That's good, because I would say that is those are the biggest kidney stones, and the ones that nestle like a Russian doll, all the other misconceptions about like human civilization, who we are, how we got here, the value of human life, what we should be doing with it, are around a narrativized understanding of human life that centralizes autonomy and will. Because that's how you get the vast majority of people in the Western world totally fine with a horrifyingly unequal social regime that sees people starving in the billions amidst unconceivable plenty. It's because they have it coming. It's because they are morally culpable. And if your understanding of history is a narrativized collection of individual decisions by people and groups, then you have a narrative that makes it their fault. If you understand it, though, in these terms, then the judgment disappears. The moral distinction disappears, and you just have people, all of whom deserve exactly what all the other of them do, at the exact same amount. And honestly, these guys are too fully committed to anarchist moralism and liberal moralism to make the connection. But if you accept this, another thing you can take from it is, well, I guess the Native Americans were pretty good, They were able to vibe, but humans just let this happen to them. And at the end of the day, it's the fault of those who who refuse to change their minds. Okay, so that was the book. We'll have a little chat next week. I'll tease it now. I think we're going to go with Leo Panich's Making of Global Capitalism. Got to get a copy of that. Don't own one. But And I like to get the I've done audiobooks, but I've gotten to the point. I know I've done Kindle. It's so convenient, but there's something about having a physical copy that's more uh, reassuring. But anyway, but maybe not. I will confirm it next week. Like I said, probably Wednesday. So take it sleazy.